raise a virtual hand at any point if you want to raise a question, and that will be indicated to me. I'm Ruth Kelly, the Senior Fellow here at Policy Exchange, and it's my delight this evening to welcome three eminent guests to talk about the Spring Statement 1 week on. We have Nicky Morgan, or Baroness Morgan of Cotes. The Right Honourable Baroness Morgan of Cotes was Secretary of State for DCMS from 2019 to 2020. She served as Education Secretary and Minister for Women and Equalities. She served also as an Assistant Whip in the Coalition government until her appointment as Economic Secretary to the Treasury in 2013. Nicky served as Financial Secretary to the Treasury as well, and she was elected Conservative MP for Loughborough in 2010. So thank you for joining us tonight, Nicky. We have Martin McTague, who's National Chair of the Federation of Small Businesses. As well as being Chair of the National Federation of Small Businesses, Martin, I believe you started your own business 35 years ago, and you now currently own and manage 3 small businesses. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say about that this evening as well. So thank you for joining us. And then we have Nick McPherson, Lord McPherson of Earl's Court. So Nick is a former senior British civil servant. He served as Permanent Secretary to the Treasury from 2005 to 2016. I think we overlapped for a small part of that tenure. You were Permanent Secretary indeed to 3 Chancellors, and you managed the department through the financial and wider economic crisis which began in 2007. You were nominated for a crossbench peerage in David Cameron's 2016 resignation honours and joined the House of Lords in 2016. So welcome to Nick this evening. So what we're going to do this evening is I'm going to ask each of our guests here tonight to speak for about 5 minutes or so on the Spring Statement. I'll ask then, throw you a few questions to get the debate going, and then I'll turn to people both physically here in the hall and also online to take questions. I aim to finish very promptly, either at or just before 6 o'clock, because I know that people have to be away. So without further ado, Nicky, can I ask you to kick off? What did you think of the Spring Statement?
Well, Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Policy Exchange for the invitation. They always say, don't they, a week is a long time in politics. I have to say, the Spring Statement feels like quite a long time ago already, as events have moved on. I suppose there were sort of 4 key things I wanted to say about the Spring Statement. One thing that wasn't mentioned in that very generous barg is that I'm a former chair of the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee, and actually the Select Committee, this is their moment when they get to quiz the Chancellor, the IFS, the OBR, and lots of other people about their views on Spring Statements of budgets. But I think if you're looking at it from the Treasury perspective, one of the key points to remember is that this was a Spring Statement and not a budget. And I think some of the general commentary had led people to expect there were going to be far more substantive announcements than the Treasury or ministers wanted to put in a Spring Statement. And I think allied to that was that there wasn't enough made of the fact that the Chancellor had already stood up a matter of a few weeks earlier and talked about support that he felt the government was going to be giving to families already facing a squeeze, particularly obviously in relation to council tax rebates, to try to deal with the higher energy bills, but also this household support fund which the government had set up in the last year. And I was surprised that there wasn't more linking between, and he did do this then in his media round the next morning, between what was announced last week and what had previously been announced. I won't say much about, because I'm really interested to hear the FSB perspective on the business support that was offered or perhaps not offered, as businesses would have wanted, particularly with higher energy costs. The second point is that I think, again, it'll be fascinating. I'm looking forward to hearing Nick on this. But my take on it is that the Treasury, and I think Rishi, are still very much in the mindset of wanting to try to rebuild fiscal credibility before the next shock. And it is true to say that we have had a succession of political and therefore leading to economic shocks in the last couple of years, and particularly in relation to the COVID support. I think the government can fairly argue that we've only been in a position to offer the generous support that we have because we were able to start to get the books back on an even keel after the financial crisis. And I was there for a very brief period in the George Osborne Treasury, and I know just how much hard work that was. So I think that's why, for example, the national insurance rise was kept, and there was much made still of trying to pay down the national debt and to get the books back in balance. And there is no doubt that when you look at the debt interest payments and you think that we're still going to be paying more next year on debt interest than we're paying on our schools budget, there is something still not quite right about how much we have had to borrow in order to pay some huge bills. I think the government's made the right choices in terms of business support and individual support over the COVID years, but that has left us with a legacy of having to pay down an awful lot of debt. The third point is that, as ever, the Chancellor was speaking to a number of different audiences. Of course, he was speaking to squeezed families and businesses out in the country. He was talking to his backbench members of Parliament who wanted reassurance and something they could answer emails from angry constituents with. He was, of course, talking to the markets, to the Bank of England about the fiscal response as well. But he was also talking about his political future. And I think that was very much the thinking behind the tax plan that was waved around at the end of the speech. And then the fourth point is just, I think, the big political point to take away from it is that the general election is going to be in 2024. That was the big announcement. The minute I heard about the income tax cut, you just have to hope that if you are the Chancellor, there is going to be no need for an early general election because the promise of an income tax cut is not the same thing as going to the country in May 24 and saying this is what I have just delivered. So lots of food for thought, but I do think that life has moved on pretty quickly, as seen by the briefing in the weekend's papers about the fact that there may well have to be more support for households, certainly even prior to an autumn budget when we see what's happened to energy prices in the course of the autumn.
Thanks very much, Nick. It'd be very interesting to see if there is more in due course. Martin, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think the whole process started with the Treasury trying to stay very disciplined about not having two essentially budgets in 1 year. But with Ukraine, all that discipline started to evaporate, and it was very difficult for them to hold that line. We were lobbying very hard on, in particular, energy issues, and we felt very strongly about the national insurance raise. The positives that came out of the statement were that we felt he went some way to answering the problems we had with fuel duty. You know, the announcement of 5p was probably about what we expected, although it's so volatile that it got swallowed up within, well, hours almost by changes in fuel. The energy or the change in VAT on energy-related installations, I think that was really welcome, because there's a lot of mixed messages coming out of government at the moment, and that one was very clear that they wanted to back that particular group of initiatives. The one, though, that we were very pleased about was the employment allowance. You know, we made it very clear that the very smallest businesses were very vulnerable to this NIC change. And if you wanted to make a difference to their position, that what you needed to do is increase the allowance. The allowance was set up to protect roughly 4 jobs. And the way it had been eroded would have meant that we would have been down to only 2 jobs protected. And that wasn't going to help some really seriously pressed businesses. My main worry that came out of it, and it's strange because a lot of the commentary doesn't really focus on this, was the absolutely anemic growth forecast that he'd got in his statement. It means that, you know, you have to have a real squeeze on spending then if you're going to hit those kind of targets, and that's something that's really worrying when you think about where we've come from over the last few years. The other thing that I was disappointed with is there was really virtually no response to the energy crisis. What we're seeing now is small businesses are squeezed between the consumer that gets a cap and the bigger businesses that can buy forward contracts. The smaller business that's not in the position to do either is completely squeezed. In the longer run, I can see there is some good planning that the Treasury's or this statement put out. The first one was the R&D tax credit. There's a really good acknowledgement that that's far too complicated, and that what ends up happening is intermediaries get involved and they have to navigate through that whole process for small businesses. There was an acknowledgement that training support was needed to be improved. And then finally, I think the fact that there was an acknowledgement as well that businesses need to invest in assets other than physical assets. They at the moment, if you look at the way in which the support is there for physical assets, it's very generous. Where we think that the Treasury has missed the opportunity to help in the past is that 80% of businesses that are service-related businesses whose main assets are intangible. How are we going to help them? And I think there was an acknowledgement in the statement that they will help them.
Great. Okay. Very interesting to explore that later. Nick, you've seen so many mini budgets, spring statements, full budgets in your time. What did you make of this one?
Well, first, the overall judgments about the public finances. Actually, I think, although he's been criticised, I think Mr. Sunak got that broadly right. This is not a time to be taking risks. Debt interest payments this year are the fastest growing public expenditure programme in government. Now, that won't necessarily be repeated if inflation can be got under control. But it's definitely a worry, and actually you don't need long-term interest rates to rise very much for expenditure on debt interest to go up. So it's also important, when you've got a bit of headroom, not to just blow it all immediately. There's a reason for having headroom. Bad things can happen. And I think it's fair to say with what's going on in Ukraine and more generally, we've got to actually try and create a bit of a buffer in case things go a whole lot worse. So that's good. On the measures, I'm all in favour of reducing national insurance at the lower end. What he's actually done is reinstitute Gordon Brown's policy, which was aligning the personal allowance with the starting rate of national insurance, except Gordon Brown did it for employers as well as employees. He hasn't got the money to do that, so he's just doing it for employees. But that's good. I find it slightly puzzling why we're raising national insurance to raise income tax, and that kind of reflects my life's experience. The first time I got a wage packet back in the late 1970s, the national insurance rate was a mere 5%. It's now going to be 13.5%, I think, 13.25%. The income tax rate in those days was 34%. It's now going to be 19%. And there's been this massive shift from income tax to national insurance. Personally, I think that's a pity. It's not that I've got anything against rentiers and capitalists, but I don't see why working should be taxed more than living off rents. And I'm not just saying this because Lord West of Spithead is here, but at a time like this, actually, I know this is not a spending round, but I would actually be putting some money by to spend more on defence, because, I mean, look, Germany's doing it, everybody else is doing it. I'm not saying we just got to copy slavishly other people, but we are going to have to spend more on defence if we're serious about strengthening protections against Russia. Final point, actually, really tunes in with yours, is around, I mean, look, the big challenge is growth and productivity. I've way moved on from the Brexit debate, but look, we've chosen to pursue trade policies which unambiguously are harming growth. The ABR it's rare that the Treasury gets a long-term estimate of the consequence of something right. But here we are, 6 years on from the referendum. The effect on growth of Brexit is tangible, and anyway, so I mean that will sort itself out in the long run, because once the Conservative Party sort of had its 30-year sort of periodic upheaval, we will return to a relationship. We won't be in the European Union, but we'll be far closer. So in 20 years' time, I can see this sorting itself out. That's just the way the pendulum swings, but it's making life difficult in the short run, which is why really majoring on a growth strategy, a lot of which is really boring. Growth is not lots of announcements. It's actually really heavy-duty focus and delivery. It requires real prime ministerial focus, something which actually our old friend Tony Blair was quite good at. I don't know whether this prime minister's quite so focused on really education, skills, infrastructure, innovation. I mean, we know what the solution to higher growth is, but it just requires persistence, focus, and cross-party support. That's why Germany transformed itself in terms of growth since the 1980s. We just don't seem to be able to do it. But doesn't mean we can't. And I hope when the proper budget comes, we will get even better measures to focus on these matters.
A fascinating points that have come out there, and I'll come back to the growth issue. But just the big judgments, first of all. So Nick, you said, Rishi Sunak has more or less got the judgments right here. What do you think about the balance between monetary and fiscal policy at the moment? Because clearly he was taking that against the background of unprecedentedly easy monetary policy.
Yeah. Well, look, it's all in the past now, but I think the Bank of England reacted to emerging inflation, which was emerging way before Ukraine came along. It reacted too little, too late. And it's meant that monetary policy is too loose. I think quantitative easing went on for too long, and this has distorted the debt market. It's distorted behaviours. I actually think it may also have had some effect on productivity, but we are where we are, and I think Rishi Sunak's policies, given where the Bank of England are, make perfectly good sense. Actually, now with events in Ukraine, energy prices going up, the cost of living squeeze, probably the Bank of England doesn't need to raise interest rates that much more. But, one of the reasons why I've got inflation is it's just been too easy to pass prices on. And I'm not terribly optimistic this will end, that there'll be a soft landing. I think we probably are due a recession at some point. But I think it is actually to Sunak's credit that he's worked well with the Bank of England. You and I, actually no, you and I were around in eras where that relationship didn't work quite so well.
That's true. We're going to talk about those now. Nick, is this something that you concur with, that the Bank of England has been a bit lax with monetary policy? And would you have preferred a slightly looser fiscal stance, a slightly tighter monetary stance?
So I do think that the Bank of England was late. I mean, to react to inflation. I think there was also, Nick's right. We are where we are. I don't think we should forget, of course, the backdrop of COVID, and just about the time when the bank might have started to be tightening was, of course, when we saw then the Omicron variant, they did start then, I suppose, in December, but nobody quite knew what was going to happen. So it's been very, very difficult to make, I think, both for the bank and also for government to make policy in the last 18 months because it is so unprecedented and so uncertain. So I think that I think that Rishi has got the judgment right in terms of wanting to work out how we're going to plug the gaps. There's no doubt that more money is needed for the health service and then social care. So actually, I think the decision on national insurance, although painful for businesses and jobs, I do think I think it was the right one to, once you've made it, the right one to stick to it. And I was very pleased actually that he and the Prime Minister read that article to say, and I think that those MPs who are calling for it not to happen, I don't actually agree with where they are. But of course, you know, then the next thing is going to be, what do you do in terms of pushing for growth and tackling the issues around productivity. So I think Rishi's instincts on this are all absolutely right, but I think it's very difficult. I mean, I was interested in the comments about growth. Of course, one of the big things, though, is that there's still so much uncertainty and volatility around. I think that probably the Treasury, again, some of the judgments were, we could say lots more on this in the spring statement, but actually people aren't going to do it because they still don't know actually how their business is going to react, what their employees are going to ask for in terms of wage rises, and actually what skills we're going to need over the next couple of years. So let's wait. So I think he probably was right to wait for some more detail for the autumn.
So do you think that he was right to build up such a big war chest over the next couple of years? I mean, there's 50 billion extra in revenues coming in as a result of high inflation, more every year over the next few years. Sort of the rate of, you know, the tax take is rising as a proportion of GDP over the next couple of years, at the time when people are seeing the biggest fall in living standards for as long as anyone can remember.
Well, I think ultimately, don't forget, he's a politician and we've got an election coming in 2 years' time. So we've already seen a bit of a down payment of that, as I say, with the announcement on income tax. I think the thing I was most surprised about last week was that there wasn't more spent via universal credit, actually. There was a bit of an announcement on the tapering in February. But as you know, that obviously the £20 given for COVID, taken away, you know, has been politically very difficult. Universal credit is a Conservative policy. And it's meant to support the very people that Conservatives, we say, the people who are working, the people for whom actually that extra money would make a difference, the ones who are going to really struggle with the cost of living, particularly energy prices. And all the stuff about council tax rebates and support funds and everything else, I think is actually far more complicated than actually giving a little bit more on universal credit would be. And so that I am surprised. If I was going to spend a bit of the war chest, that's what I would have spent it on actually last week.
Thank you. And Martin, on the pro-growth agenda, I'm sure this is something your members would really like to see. Can you wait for these measures?
You know what, there is a real crisis going on right now, and I think there are a lot of fragile businesses that have just struggled through the pandemic, and then they get hit by this massive wave of inflation. And I don't think the government has quite grasped how fragile a lot of these small businesses are. I mean, what was it the OBR said that the other day, that 5% of the businesses they'd surveyed could not see a future? You know, that we're talking about something like 250,000 businesses that could fall victim to that kind of process. And that means you've got to give them a reason why they should invest their life and what little resource they've got left in the future. And some of that will be about how they deal with issues like the 3 issues I mentioned before. You know, how are you going to encourage people to train workforce? How are you going to encourage them to invest in new ideas, in new equipment, in new people? You know, this is the thing that I think they've got to focus on, and the sort of thing that we were talking about earlier. You know, a laser-like focus on those issues will, I think, diminish a lot of the other problems.
Well, let me turn to some questions now. So please do remember to raise a hand virtually if you're online, and I will come to you in due course. But we do have a question from our defence expert here in the front. And please introduce yourselves for everybody as well, if you would, at the same time.
Admiral West, simple sailor. I want to pick up Nick's point. I do find it extraordinary. We have a war in Europe, a very unpleasant and nasty bloody war. There is a possibility, let's hope it doesn't happen, of a world war. And yet, in this announcement of spend, there's no mention at all of money for the armed forces. And we mustn't delude ourselves. There are shortfalls in stocks. There are a whole raft of things that need to be spent immediately if they think there's a likelihood of a war suddenly appearing. And I think it's a very strange message to have given to not actually say that there should be money for the armed forces. And I think it's the sort of thing that people like Putin look at. It's the sort of thing that our allies look at. And as Nick rightly says, the Germans have said they're going to spend an extra 82 billion. The Australians have increased their defence budget gigantically. The Danes have increased their defence. It is extraordinary, I think, and I don't think it's a good message. And I am very surprised, actually, I have to say. I did some research, and over the last 300 years in similar circumstances, our Treasury has always allowed us to spend money on the armed forces. And yet here we are, we've obviously, we've got a new sort of way of doing things, and I'd be very interested in what the panel thinks. I think it's a bad message. I think we should be spending it, and let's hope we don't end up with a world war. And Nick, thank you for getting the 2 carriers as well. You were perm-sec when that happened. I was delighted.
Nikki, as the politician on the panel, perhaps you deal with that one first.
Well, so I think you're right about the message that not mentioning its ends. And I think back to 2 years ago when there was an equivalent, was that a budget or a spring statement, and COVID had just happened, and lo and behold, we thought 12 billion was generous at that point on COVID, and not realising how much was going to have to be spent. So I don't know whether whether there's wider politics at play here, whether either, I suspect the Treasury view of the MOD is that we keep giving them the money and it keeps being more and more of a black hole, so what do they want the money for? Would be one thing. I do think this orthodoxy about it's a spring statement, not a budget, and therefore we haven't talked to other departments about spending, why this one? I'm not saying this is right, I'm just saying I think this may be the thinking. Or the third thing, of course, is that actually it's number 10 who want to announce more spending on defence, not the Chancellor in his spring statement, and there'll be something else coming on that. Could be the other wider Whitehall politics at play here. That's my hunch for the reasoning behind it.
Nick, do you think there's more to come?
Well, I thought so. For precisely the reasons Lord West has set out. And bear in mind also that inflation will be hitting the MOD as much as everybody else. I mean, there is an argument for sort of good order and discipline about fiscal events, and Mr. Johnson has kind of favoured announcements out of that sort of kilter, which is why I kind of, if I'd been in the Treasury, I'd have said, look, we're going to spend this money, it's bound to happen, so let's sort of put a claim against the reserve for this year. Future years will be a matter for the spending review, the budget, but sort of nod, wink, wink, that actually the money for the reserve would inevitably carry through to future years, because, I mean, look, I'm obviously all in favour of the aircraft carriers. It'd be nice to spend some money to equip them even better, even better, and maybe, I mean, whether they can go through the Dardanelles, I don't know, but probably not. But I'm sure it would be useful to have one in the Eastern Mediterranean at the current time. But there's a serious point also about our armed forces. I mean, look, obviously, when I was a Treasury official, you just try and, in the end, it's so difficult to control public spending. You basically bear down on wherever politicians are going to put up with it. And the reality is, between 1990 and 2020, defence was always quite an easy target. There were occasional times like the Iraq War where you had to spend more. And I just worry about the size of our armed forces at the current time. I know tanks, actually, it's proven, have gone out of, they're slightly out of fashion. But my guess is we've got very few tanks which work at the current time. And even the Navy, I just remember the amount, getting our submarines out at sea, or having the capacity to put more than one out at sea of a nuclear variety, was a massive challenge. And so I think we're going to have to reappraise. The problem is, and this is a real challenge for whoever governs this country over the next 10 years, you've got the demographic time bombs finally sort of exploding, and we've recognised that with the social care levy and so on. And we've had the COVID crisis, so people want a better national health service. We've got massive waiting lists. there's a whole lot of stuff to do to support businesses. We're already raising the corporation tax to 25%. We are, I'm convinced that in the end, Mr. Sunak will give some of these tax increases back, but we are facing a tax burden not seen since the days of Stafford Cripps. This is quite a difficult set of issues for whoever governs this country. And I mean, politics is all about difference, but actually the interesting thing is a 90%, which generally remains the same. And you know, actually there are a whole lot of things, although they couldn't admit it when they were politicians, or ministers, I should say, because Lord West wasn't a politician, he was a minister though. There are a whole lot of things actually which we kind of know have to be dealt with. And if ever you wanted a cross-party consensus on them, whether it's growth, defence, and so on,
Energy,
it's now.
Yep.
Energy. We haven't even.
Energy.
So
Yeah.
look, I'm under no illusion. We're just in the rest of the 2020s is going to be hard work.
Martin, did you want to comment?
Well, I mean, I'm well outside my comfort zone when talking about defence issues, but I mean, I bow to the knowledge of our simple sailor there, Lord West, and I think it seems to me that if you're not prepared to borrow money in an emergency for something that's clearly a national priority, then something's wrong. I also think that, in a strange way, the government has pushed a lot of the burden of this war, which it is, in technically speaking, it isn't a shooting war, but it's we're at war with Russia in every other sense. It's pushed the burden of that onto businesses and ordinary consumers. And so I think there must be some point where government steps up and says, actually, we have to accept our responsibilities.
Thank you. And I'll go online now to Diana Berry before coming back to the room. So, Diana, do you have a question? And don't forget to unmute yourself, please. No. We may come back to Diana in due course. In the meantime, let me turn back to the room. And please do say who you are.
Thank you, Chris Sanger, Head of Tax Policy at EY and former Treasury official, with a number of those on the panel. As part of the tax plan, the Chancellor produced, or as part of the spring statement, the Chancellor produced his tax plan, not necessarily the flashy blue document that he waved, but actually the chapter included in the spring statement. And that really focused on the three things of capital, people, and ideas. Reading through that, this seems to be a move away from the Treasury approach of past. We've seen a corporation tax rate that's going up to 25%, and this seems to be much more interventionist in terms of the approach that Treasury. It used to be that Treasury's mantra was we would lower the rate, we'd broaden the base, and let business make the decisions. So am I right to be expecting that the autumn budget, when it comes, will actually be reminiscent of the days of Gordon Brown, much more interventionist, much more of ideas and incentives? So that's the first question. And then with that, is that likely to be effective in terms of, in your views, bringing investment here into the UK?
Okay, before I come to Nick to answer that, let me go to Martin and say, corporation tax is rising quite steeply. There are going to be incentives for R&D and investment and so forth. How do your members think about that?
Well, corporation tax is never an issue very high on the agenda for most small businesses because, you know, nobody seems to mind paying tax out of profits they're generating. What they hate is things like business rates where you're paying it before you even start earning anything. I think the big thing that's changed, I think the three priorities are right, but the big things that's changed, and maybe it passes a lot of people by, is the introduction of making tax digital. Because what that means is that you're changing the relationship between HMRC and their customers, as they call us. And so what we've now got is a responsibility on them to change behavior, and they've got a very powerful tool to do it because they can provide incentives, they can provide information. They don't have to worry about how complex these tax arrangements are, because all the wiring can get hidden in the new digital tax arrangements. So I think that the world is changing. The way in which HMRC and the Treasury tax people, and tax businesses in particular, is changing dramatically. And I think that's something that we'll all have to take into account.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Nick, are we back to New Labour and the 5 drivers of productivity and, you know, the sort of micro measures on the tax side to try and produce growth? And is that a good thing?
Well, I'm afraid reflecting, you know, creeping old age, I started working in the Treasury in the 1980s and unambiguously favoured the sort of Lawsonian approach of as wide a tax base as possible, but lower rates as possible. And I mean, look, we are definitely back. Brown, Johnson, Sunak have quite a lot in common, actually. And it's, look, you have to accept as a Treasury official that Chancellors have their 2 occasions. You know, they say they only have 1 occasion, but it always ends up being 2, where they go down the House of Commons and they pull rabbits out of the hat. And I can remember having these discussions with George Osborne, where George Osborne would say to me, look, you know, I can deliver the strategy the Treasury wants, but you've got to help me on these ridiculous announcements, you know, which you have to fill a budget speech with. And, you know, that was quite a kind of deal which obviously we would have provided all those options anyway. But you know, governments have to, politicians have to sort of paint pictures, and sometimes you do have to announce small reliefs here, there, and so on. Where tax reliefs are always good in principle because they're more focused than generalized tax cuts. But take the R&D tax credit. I've seen businesses who are claiming R&D tax credits for stuff which, I mean, it was never intended for. You know, this is sort of financial service businesses spending a bit on IT and claiming an R&D tax credit. So I just worry how, it's not your industry, but it's an industry you have worked in, kind of utilizes reliefs. I also worry that, I know, look, the technology is changing, and it may be that actually it's easier to exploit reliefs if you're a small business. But so many small business people, they're so busy just getting on, trying to make a profit, to understand all these reliefs. And ones which are sort of generalized and come through just in a rate or in an allowance are just, in my view, simpler than those very targeted, here's a little thing for small businesses. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, things like the national insurance, employment allowance or whatever it is, isn't a good thing. I think in principle it is. But I worry that tax rates are going up across the board because in a sense, we're avoiding difficult decisions on this. And I'm also worried, as I said earlier, that, you know, we continually are bumping up taxes which don't impact on rentiers or affluent old people. There's something which has gone slightly wrong. Obviously, the focus groups just think old people, got to let them off, they'll vote, et cetera, But so I can understand why he's doing it, and some of it may be good, but he just risks ending up having a high tax rate system. And I can remember in the 1980s, the Thatcherites sort of pointing to socialist France and saying, you know, socialist France, no wonder they've got high unemployment, they've got 30% social insurance contributions. Well, once you add employer and employee together, we've now got 30% social insurance contributions, which is extraordinary. That's double the rate it was even 20 years ago. So these are difficult issues.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Nikki. So you've got a rising debt to tax burden, rising tax burden, a larger state basically than we've seen for a very, very, very long time. You've got a very interventionist Chancellor who wants to try and get business investment to grow. Wouldn't it have been sort of easier just to say that COVID, Brexit, Ukraine, we know what's caused low business investment over the last 10 years, and actually we now just need a period of stability and certainty?
Well, I'm sure he'd have loved to have stood up and said we needed a period of stability and certainty. Unfortunately, we are absolutely not, it appears, not in that situation. I think it would have been it would have been a totally different backdrop, and it could even have been a different spring statement if we hadn't had the war in Ukraine. Because I think by early to mid-February, I mean, we probably would have had still the higher than expected inflation, but I think we would be able to already be perhaps the bank, and we would be able to begin to see a trajectory downwards. Energy prices wouldn't have done what they're doing. I mean, gas prices today are yet again all over the place, and everything else. But I think at the heart of the question was the word intervention, interventionist. And I think that actually plays into the sort of the two sides of the Chancellor, and therefore the Treasury, and therefore the government at the moment, and I'd say the Conservative Party. On the one hand, there are people, and this is within the same person, there'll be people who absolutely believe in low tax rates, you know, you let people keep more of their own money, including businesses, but individuals, they make the right decisions for themselves. But on the other hand, you've also got some constituencies, some MPs therefore calling things very interventionist. We had 2 years of real intervention. And I think the people, the public, the message coming back now is people are expecting more and more. What's the government going to do? And so energy prices, if you had a true, what you might call, you know, laissez-faire, Thatcherite conservative type government, they would say, well, yes, there are high energy prices, but actually, you know, what's the role of the government in helping people to pay for this? But there is such a call for there to be a step in. What are we literally going to do? Put money into people's pockets, into business pockets, so they're able to deal with energy prices. It's very confusing for any government, I think, to know how to respond to that. And then you add in the issues that you know, Nick and others have talked about, but you know, particularly the social care demographic time bomb, the need for the education system to catch up with the skills that the businesses need in the 21st century, some really complicated issues, which government, I just don't think has had the bandwidth after 2 years of COVID and now a war to actually sit there and really think through what the policy responses should be.
So do you think we will have a permanently larger state, or do you think this is just a question of timing, that ultimately the government will start thinking about how to reform the public sector and reduce the size of the state and so forth?
I think that will happen, but I'm not quite sure when. And as we're running into, as I say, you know, an election 2 years hence, and don't forget a number of seats which the government feels that they will need to retain in order to keep their majority, are often places where people actually have no problem with there being a big state. I think that's why you see such a mixed message coming out in the government response.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And we've got a question here on the floor.
Thank you. Neil Carmichael, Chief Executive of UCEC, and actually a former Education Select Committee Chair. Now, with two Education Secretaries, former Education Secretaries on the panel, productivity having been mentioned, I think, 6 times, war chests mentioned too, would it not be a good idea to splash out a bit on education? Because, of course, that is one of the big breaks in terms of delivering a more productive economy now and in the medium term. And I can think of a number of aspects of education policy you could upgrade. And as Nikki has pointed out, we are paying more on interest than we are on schools. So it might be a timely moment to consider that one.
Very interesting question. I have the prerogative of chair, of course, of turning directly to Nikki on this one, and then I'll come to you, Martin, afterwards.
Well, I mean, again, I suspect this is why the Treasury and the Chancellor wanted to keep it to a spring statement and not start talking about departmental spending, because every department, you know, and I think schools and colleges, I would say, you know, because I don't think we should forget sixth form and post-16 education as well, which I think is absolutely vital in terms of tackling the productivity challenge. Although, of course, I don't think we're still entirely clear what we mean by tackling the productivity challenge. I'm not sure we've got the answer. But yes, of course, spending more money. If I were Nadeem, I would have been saying, you know, I need more money. The issue is going to be what do you spend it on, and where do you spend it? And of course, one of the criticisms of last week was that there was no talk about what's going to happen in terms of wage rises for those working in schools. There has been a bit more talk about wage rises for people working in the health service, but inflation is going to affect every public sector employee's take-home wages. But I think if you really want to tackle productivity, actually there needs to be another look at the curriculum fit for the 21st century. But I would just share the challenge in a way also to businesses, because I think there's lots of talk over the years about businesses working with the education system, trying to fashion the curriculum, the skills that are coming out and all the rest of it. But let's be honest, there are still an awful lot of businesses, partly because they're too busy running their businesses, actually who are ready to take on that challenge of both shaping the curriculum, but then training the workforce of the future. I think there's been lots of stop-starts in terms of government policy. I think there have been some better things like the Kickstart scheme, for example. I think the apprenticeship scheme is beginning to show results, but you know, it depends on the size of the company and the business and everything else. But that is another huge problem, Neil, which I think we're going to spend the rest of the 2020s trying to answer.
And Martin, I mean, surely this is a really big issue for small businesses in particular, to get involved in the education system sufficiently.
It's a massive issue, but I think the problem is quite neatly illustrated by COVID. You know, when COVID struck, I don't think there were many retailers out there were looking for coders and people with advanced IT skills. But as soon as they knew they were going to have to pivot to a brand new type of operation, which would require a lot more of those skills, they were suddenly on the market for them. And I think that's part of the problem. You know, you ask your average small business, what do they anticipate in 5 and 10 years' time? There's blank faces in every room, because really they don't have that kind of perspective. They can see 1 or 2 months ahead. So it's really going to be very difficult if you're going to ask individual small businesses to predict what they're likely to need, and therefore what the educational requirements are going to be in a few years from now. I think the more immediate problem is going to be with the apprenticeship system, because you know it's under a massive attack from some of the big corporates who say they don't want to be paying the levy. But actually, unless there's non-levy payers are receiving that subsidy and are able to engage in training apprentices in a significant way, then we're all going to be a lot poorer in the future.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left. I'm just going to ask you all whether you think the Chancellor has done enough to deal with the cost of living crisis in the short term, or whether you think politically or economically this budget will start to unravel. Nick?
Look, whatever happened with this big increase in energy, you're either going to get real wages falling, or you're going to get unemployment. Mm-hmm. You know, we are worse off as a country. There's no two ways about it. You can sort of pretend that away. You could borrow huge amounts of money and splash it around everybody, but that would probably generate more inflation anyway. It's a long, hard, and quite rocky road. Now, I recognise if you're a politician, that's not a very popular message. So, if I stood at the Treasury, what I'd be saying to Mr. Sunak is, look, you've got to pace yourself on this. Yes, people are going to be back for more. There are going to be other priorities anyway, which you're going to have to deal with. So don't blow it all now. I mean, if anything, in my view, he probably blew a bit too much on the sort of dramatic national insurance gesture, the income tax gesture. I know for internal Tory party reasons he had to show he was a tax cutter, but actually the electorate, you know, aren't particularly interested in tax cuts in a few years' time at this stage. What they're interested in is a sort of coherent messaging about how we're going to get through this. So, look, as I said at the beginning, I think in general terms, I think he did the right thing. But you know, modern politics is a very rough business, and the pressure of always something must be done, even when it's blindingly obvious nothing can be done, is just slightly depressing to an old lag like myself.
Martin.
I don't think there was any magic bullet that Rishi Sunak could have fired at the spring statement. I mean, I thought he had to focus his fire on those things that were, you know, those issues that were the most vulnerable, the most pressing issues. In some ways, he'd created his own problem by increasing national insurance, but at least I have to be grateful for the fact that he increased employment allowance, which protected the most vulnerable in that situation.
Okay. And Nikki, will this unravel?
Well, I think already the Chancellor did not get the reaction that he hoped for and that he was used to. I mean, after you spent 2 years handing out support money through COVID grants and being thanked a lot, you know, it was always going to be a difficult thing to land. And I think your question, Ruth, has he done enough? I'm not sure what enough looks like in terms of helping with the cost of living. I think there were other ways, as I've already said, about getting money into the hands of those who are most going to feel the high energy prices over the next few months. And I think that will be revisited. I think there will be more. I suspect there'll be more announcements between, you know, him and between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson in the course of the next couple of months, and definitely more to come autumn budget.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank our panellists for joining us this evening. It's been a fantastic debate. Really good of you to come to Policy Exchange. Thanks to our audience as well. Thank you.